So all of us want a future where we are free to be our authentic selves, where we are free from rigid boxes, where we are free to make decisions about our bodies, free to show up for our families, for ourselves, for our communities, in all of the ways that we know how and that we want to. And we unfortunately know that there is and has been for many decades this extremely vocal minority of far-right bad actors that are continually organizing to move us further away from this vision of the future that we are all working towards. Still, we know that that world is within our grasp, and we know that the road to get there cannot be paved simply by saying what we don't want, right? We have to think of the shared vision of the future that we want to and can create together and will create together when we join forces, when we bring together panels like this, discussions of leaders across movements, to create that shared vision, create that shared roadmap, and integrate what we've found together into building that future. We have to all continually work together, and specifically within narrative and comms, work to develop a consistent and coordinated narrative strategy across organizations, across movement ecosystems, across communities that brings together the largest number of people possible into that shared vision of the future and into developing the path that we are building to get there. So you're going to hear over this next hour from a number of wonderful panelists, movement leaders who have worked together, who have worked to do just that, who have worked to build infrastructure within our movements, build narrative strategy, generate ideas, come up with teachings, learnings, and really get us closer to building narrative power for the world that we deserve. So since we are live streaming, one of the things I'm going to have the panelists do as we go ahead and do a round of intros is to describe what their visual presentation so that folks following along at home, especially those who are visually impaired, are able to follow fully. So I turn it over to all of you panelists, going straight down the line, starting with Anna to give a brief introduction.
Hi all, my name is Anna Castro, my pronouns are they, them, and I am the Principal Narrative Strategist at Transgender Law Center. I am a brown Latina person that is extremely oily right now under these shiny lights, with curly hair, sweating. And I work for the nation's largest trans-led organization advocating for a world in which trans and non-binary people are alive, thriving, and fighting for liberation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Teal Insunza. I use she and her pronouns. I have brown hair. I'm wearing a black mask and a black short-sleeve t-shirt. I am the Associate Vice President of Justice Initiatives at the Urban Resource Institute, which is located in New York City. I've been an economic justice advocate for over a decade, and I've been specifically working with survivors of violence and queer and trans folks for that amount of time. I've done organizing on a city, state, and national level around issues of economic justice, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
Hey y'all, my name is Luchi Omioga. I use any pronouns. I am a black trans masculine person, currently wearing a black mask, also wearing black traditional Nigerian wear. If you can smell through the TV, I smell delicious. I am a Leo Sun, Scorpio Moon, Libra Rising, it matters. I am the co-executive director and co-founder of the Black LGBTQIA+ Migrant Project, or BLMP, and we work at the intersections of race, sex, gender, and sexuality and migration to see a world without forced migration where no one, especially black people, are forced to give up their homelands.
Hey y'all, my name is Maria Chijov. I use they and she pronouns. I am from Chicago, Midwest Pride. Yes. I am a white, short-haired person wearing a maroon blazer. And my background is in reproductive justice, and more broadly in gender justice, most recently in an organization called Ultraviolet. And when I think about gender justice, I really think about it as an expansive framework that encompasses all of us and all of our gender expressions, and building a world where we can all express ourselves in the ways that we want and that we need.
Thank you, everyone. Can confirm we're all a group of oily but wonderful smelling people up here. My name is Arielle. My pronouns are they, them. I am a communications consultant and media strategist, currently working with Transgender Law Center and separately for Jewish Voice for Peace, doing a lot of communications work. I want to start off by defining some of the terms that we've already used up here that I used in my introduction and have Anna sort of bring us into the session that way. So Anna, I'd love if you could get us started off by defining narrative power, narrative strategy, and also how narrative strategy is a way to get us closer to the world that we deserve.
Yes, absolutely. So we are human beings who love stories. Stories are how we understand the world. And using some definitions from Reframe, Narrative Initiative, just starting with, a story is something that has a sequence of events with a beginning, middle, and end. And therefore, a narrative is a collection of stories told over time that articulate a particular worldview, value set that allows us to understand the world. A beautiful metaphor for this is, stories are to tiles as narrative is to a mosaic. So we tell a lot of stories in our work in order to be able to actually communicate through complicated legal jargon, through 100-page reports, through legislation that can be up to 1,000 pages. Stories actually help us ground ourselves in a vision of the world. And therefore, narrative strategy is actually analyzing the stories that are being told, understanding the narrative ecosystem that they encompass, and actually finding the ones that we want to turn the volume up on and the ones that we want to turn the volume down on. For every narrative, there is a counter narrative. For every helpful narrative, there are harmful narratives. And in order to build narrative power, we have to work together to understand the stories that are meaningful to our communities, the stories that allow us to share a vision of the world, that allows us to, one, build on economic, social, or political power to shift material conditions on the ground for our communities. And one of the things that I am just very excited about is that everyone is talking about narrative right now. It is that hot little jargon word that everyone is throwing around. And I think that it's a beautiful beginning to us really understanding what is the story of the movement that we have internalized, what is the story of the movement that we are sharing, which is separate to the stories that we are using to build power. And the stories right now being leveraged against us to take away power.
Thank you so much, Anna. So I want to turn it over to some of our other panelists, starting with Teal, to talk a little bit about how this looks within various movement ecosystems. So Teal, a lot of people describe economic justice, the type of work that you do, as one of the key underpinnings of collective liberation. So I want to hear from you a little bit about how this is, why this is, and the lesson that other leaders in this room, outside of this room, should be gleaning from this.
Sure. So I'm going to start by defining how I view economic justice, and we might all have different definitions, but in my mind, economic justice is asking us to imagine a world where no one experienced the violence of poverty. And that's a big ask. And for that very reason, it is the connector of all movements. There's not a person in this room who isn't impacted by money and scarcity, unless we have secret billionaires here, but I don't think we do. If you are, you could give some money to the movement, or you can leave. I'm just saying. We all need money to survive in the world in which we live in at this very moment. And the communities that we're a part of are often those that have been very systemically and systematically removed from those sectors, right? Many of us who grew up as Latino or Latinx or, in different communities, have not been able to access these financial sectors in order to survive in our current context. I think that we often talk about economic justice and it sounds like very scary, like the stock market or like your credit score. But essentially economic justice is really about how we live. It's how we have access to food, safe and stable housing, quality education, meaningful work, and essentially are able to live the life that we want and that we choose. Poverty restricts choice, and by doing so, we're forced into living lives that are difficult and are struggles. There's a scarcity mentality among many communities. So I think that when we're talking about how our movements are connected, if our movements aren't focused on people's ability to live and have access to basic needs, then we're not really serving those that we're organizing for. So I think that, it's a major connector to answer your question.
Thank you so much. It's like one of the foundations before we can get any other sort of meaningful justice has to be fed by having the money and the resources that we all need to thrive. So Lucy, you have worn a lot of different hats in a lot of different workspaces, but one of these hats that you have worn is as a community organizer. And I am wondering, I'd love to hear from you about the role of community organizing and of protest in building not only people power, but this idea of narrative power that we're talking about today.
Yeah, definitely. I can start, to answer that question, I can start with a personal story, my coming into organizing per se. So I started organizing in 2011, 2010 when I was in college in New York. And I remember at that time, it's when I came out. And so like most people in college, when they come out, they join the GSA at that time and start becoming political queer. And I remember at that time in 2011, there was a black trans woman who was arrested and put in a men's penitentiary in Minneapolis. And so for context, I am from the great state of Minnesota. Born and raised. My parents are from Nigeria. And I remember being in New York at that time and organizing with people in New York around things that were happening in Minnesota was wild to me. And it was wild to me that this narrative, these protests were happening all over the country when no one in New York even knew where Minnesota was, to be completely honest. And so after that, I came back to Minnesota, and because of the power of protest and organizing, I started doing organizing in Minnesota at that time in 2012, 2013. And that was when we saw a lot of what we now call the Black Liberation Movement and the Movement for Black Lives, which for me has been the biggest narrative shift of my entire life. Like I reiterated before, my parents are immigrants from Nigeria, and one of the dominant narratives in a lot of African communities is the fact that you are African and not black. And that was something that was put into my mind at a very young age, and I had to do a lot of unlearning with protest and organizing to undo some of those harmful narratives that were separating these two beautiful communities. And so we talk about narrative power mixed with organizing, and we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement because it actually shifts culture and shifts material conditions. And I say that as someone who has been shifted by the Black Lives Matter movement specifically. And in 2015, Minneapolis, I was working with Black Lives Matter Minneapolis at that time. I was on the core team. And there was a police killing in Minneapolis from by a black man named Jamar Clark. And that was when we started the coldest 18-day occupation of a police precinct. Shout out to Minneapolis for always being on the head of the curve as far as protests. We also shut down the Mall of America not once but twice. We shut down the highways, one of the first highway shutdowns the United States has ever seen. And I say this because this is what activated people and continue to activate people towards motion. I also say this because in 2015, I remember I was staying outside all the time in negative 30-degree weather. If you've ever been to Minneapolis in the November, you know it's very cold. And I remember my parents at that time didn't understand why I was doing what I was doing. And they were like, you're not like black people that are descendants of slaves. You are African. Why are you doing this? And I remember that we had a lot of deep conversations about why it was important, because at the end of the day, I am black. And so fast forward, after Philando Castile in 2016, that happened in St. Paul, and then also, as most of you know, in 2020, I'm also the co-founder of Black Visions in Minneapolis, which is an abolitionist black queer-led organization that galvanized literally the entire globe in 2020 around abolition and defunding the police. And at that time, I remember having conversations with my parents, and it was no longer, why are you doing this, but I understand why you're doing this. And that is the power of narrative shift work mixed with protest, is that we are actually seeing the shifts in our parents' generations and even our generation's mentality around why it's important to show up. Another kind of example of protest that a lot of people don't really see as protest is the interrogation of our democracy in this moment, right? So there's a lot of conversations on the left around, do we just vote, or what does a protest vote look like? And we're constantly being pitted to choose between the lesser of two evils without actually interrogating, are we in a democracy in the first place, right? What is the narratives around our civic engagement that are harmful, and how is it that the narratives that we're trying to output are being lessened or not being listened to? And so, as far as like the importance, is what we know that when we have a narrative that is actually strategic and is moving people, there will always be an anti-dominant narrative. We saw that with Black Lives Matter, we saw Blue Lives Matter, we saw All Lives Matter, right? And so what are the ways that we are actually combating that as activists and advocates, and still continuing to push, as we said, a bigger we, and a narrative that more people can actually cling on to?
Yeah, that was beautiful. Thank you so much, Aluchi. So Maria, I want to turn to you, and your work is within the repro space, within the gender justice space. And we know, unfortunately, that even within the left, there are a lot of divisions with regards to how we talk about reproductive justice. So I want to hear from you a little bit about where these divisions lie, how the right wing actually exploits these divisions, and how we can leverage that desire and that mobilization on the right to build control for our own movements and for our own narratives.
Absolutely. So I really think that kind of the divisions on the left come down to whether you see abortion specifically as a political tool to get women voters. And I put women voters in very heavy quotes because we're talking about white women voters. And I think that's a very cynical way of looking at it, but I think if we sort of boil down to the core of it, that's really what it boils down to. And if you look at abortion in that way, then you find yourself in a lot of defensive fights. You find yourself talking about, is it a 6-week abortion ban or a 10-week abortion ban? We're going to fight for a 10-week ban. Well, guess what? A 10-week ban is still a ban on people controlling their own bodies and their own decisions. So, and I think that's the ground that the right wants us to fight on. The right wants us to be in these conversations that are about these nuances of policy that for an average person is going to say, you know what, I still can't get an abortion. Like, it doesn't matter if we win or not, I still don't get the thing that I need. I think the alternative vision here is one that does build that biggest possible we, that looks at, okay, what is at the core of this? What is at the core of reproductive justice? And the folks, the Black women activists who coined the term reproductive justice really looked at this as a broad framework that's not just about abortion, but it's about the ability to have a child or not have a child, to raise a child in safety, to raise a family in a community where you feel safe, to make decisions about your own body. And when we talk about it and we think about it as a broad framework, then we are bringing in so many more people into that struggle and into that conversation. And we're having a conversation that people can say, okay, I get how my life will be different if we win. And I think that's the thing that's going to empower people to fight for the vision of what we want. There's a book called 7 Strategies for Practical Radicals, and one of the things that the authors Deepak Bhagrav and Stephanie Luce talk about is this idea that the right is terrified of our vision. Because if we get to be in a place where we actually lay out our vision for the future, that's really compelling. And so they want to keep us from laying that out at every possible way. And so I think the thing that we do, the thing that we counter, is at every possible moment, we need to be focusing on what's the bigger picture? Who are all the people who are impacted? How do we bring more people into this conversation? And how do we give people something to fight for that they actually feel like is going to make a difference in their lives?
Yeah, and going off of what all of our amazing panelists have said, going back to the idea of like, what is our movement narrative? One of the things that I note as like being something that is, we need to unpack as a movement, whatever movement we're a part of, is this idea that if a person has one belief and they express it in some way, that's it. That's all there is about it. We've embedded a lot of disposability politics within the work that we do, and we've forgotten something that is core to being in any movement, which is organizing and relationship building. And I really love how Aluchi brought in the fact that, like, for many of us, and I think Maria, everybody, and Teal have brought it in as well, it's this idea that we have all within our families, particularly if you have an identity that lies at the intersections of liberation, we have had to be in relationship with people within our communities, within our families that don't necessarily share our beliefs. And we remain in conversation with them. We continue on telling the story of the work that we are doing. And I think that's core to really understanding, like, is our movement a space in which people are allowed to transform? And are we doing work in communities that engages in these harder, tougher conversations in a way that understands that you will experience discomfort in this work? You are in a movement and doing work to change conditions on the ground because you are capable of holding that discomfort. And that is one of the meta narratives embedded in this space right now, that the right is also weaponizing against us. And at times it's hilarious because I'm in plenty of movement spaces where we believe that if you're using the right language and if you're in the right meetings and if you're working for the right organizations, that you somehow have a particular politic and refuse to work with others, refuse to work with other organizations, refuse to work within other movements. And I think throughout Netroots conference, we've heard from intergenerational movement leaders who have told us, this is a struggle, y'all, and it doesn't end. We achieve one beautiful dream to find another that someone else has born forth in this moment. And so I feel like, in tying together, like, how do you actually build the bigger, stronger we? It is about holding that discomfort, holding those conversations, and remembering that at the core of whatever role you have in this work, you have to be an organizer.
Yeah, this is Aluchi. I really appreciate that, Anna. Even just like, my question is like, where's the debate and movement? And I'm really happy if y'all were like downstairs and you saw like, the person that had like the Netroots is obscene, change my mind. Like, that is the energy that we need in our movements, while holding the humanity of everyone, but still challenging the ideas, like, where is agitation? And agitation doesn't mean disposability, but agitation does mean questioning the comfort that we all have. And I think just to anchor that, I think the things that we need to do, especially contextually in the United States, as I'll talk about in a little bit, working in the global south and outside of like the imperial underbelly, is your comfort or your discomfort in this moment is actually less than the majority of the people in the world. And so how are you holding that discomfort and not coming out with a sense of urgency, but also questioning why are we not following the lead of the people that are the most uncomfortable?
Yeah, that pause and reflect that's really necessary in our movement spaces too. The pause to assess where the urgency is coming from, but also the assessing, like what are the political conditions that I am not yet aware of, and how am I making space to be uncomfortable?
I think also it's easy to feel like, this is a short-term like struggle. But those of us in this work are going to do it for life, and we're all just shuffling around to different organizations, but we're in relationship and community with each other for much longer than we work at one place or we're at one specific job. We're all, I'm sure, doing this work because we care deeply about it. It's rooted in love and care for our communities and wanting to see the world look different. That means that we have to learn to work together and struggle with each other. This work is about the struggle. It's about working and getting right in relationship with each other, because if we can't create that within our own spaces, we can't create that in other spaces. So I think I agree with what everyone's saying here.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And I think something I want to emphasize, and something that I've heard a lot throughout Netroots throughout the past couple of years, is that none of us arrived into this world with perfect politics. In fact, none of our politics are perfect right now, right? And like to offer an individual example, just over 5 years ago, I was on Birthright Israel, because I was raised in a Zionist family that believed that Israel was the birthright and the property of the Jewish people. While I was on this trip, I was messaged and called in by a number of my friends, a number of my family members who did hold more progressive views on Palestine than I did. And they didn't yell at me, they didn't, call me names. They asked me why I thought what I thought, why I felt what I felt, why I believed what I believed. They called me in with kindness and compassion, and I met them at that. I met them there, and it wasn't an immediate switch. I didn't just drop that Zionist upbringing right away, but I took the next, admittedly, a year and a half to 2 years to unlearn the Zionist upbringing I had, and came back to those same people with a gratitude and thank you for helping me develop my understanding of the world. And now I stand up here as a proud anti-Zionist Jewish person who works with JVP. And these on a macro level are the conversations that each of you as people in the movement, each of you within your families, within your communities, this is the impact that you can all make when you commit to meeting people where they're at, helping understand why they believe what they believe, and bringing them forward to the world that we all know that we want to live in.
I also just want to add, I think it's really important, we're talking about kind of the narratives that we have around different aspects of our movement, but I think we've also talked about how all of it is so interconnected, right? We all need financial security. We all have bodies that we navigate the world through. We all experience all of these different compounding oppressions in different ways. And I think it's really important for us to understand that we're gonna make mistakes. I think Arielle's example is great. We are going to say things, we are going to do things, and holding yourself to a bar of perfection is going to just leave you paralyzed in this place of okay, I guess I can't say anything, I guess I can't do anything. And I think that I would really sort of advocate for folks to don't go out there kind of from the hip, but really move through this space with the assumption that you're going to make mistakes, and build the kind of community that's going to call you in with love, and that's going to help you navigate through that.
And that's a really important component of building narrative power. The infrastructure to actually leverage narrative power is built only through relationships, and only through relationships that can stand the test of time, that can stand the test of, the gentle call-in, that can stand the test of the loud online call-in. We're talking about, and I think Alucci was referring to this as well, we're looking at the transformation of so many institutions in this moment. And that type of paradigm shift is only possible when people are able to have these conversations in which they're sharing other visions for what the world can be. And that is, again, everything that we're talking about here, and even the work that we've been able to do together only happened because we were able to see each other and be with each other and hold each other through times of immense struggle.
So I've heard from a couple of you sort of some of these misses that we can make when we're working in silos, like ways in which when we work in silos, we miss opportunities to build a broader we, to work together across movements, to bring more people into our movements. Like I've heard that in Maria talking about the way that other various organizations message for reproductive justice. And Anna, I kind of want to turn it over to you to talk about a tool that we use a lot at Transgender Law Center, which is the race, class, gender narrative messaging framework. It is one tool for messaging across movements. And so after hearing about some of this work, can you talk to us about RCGN, race, class, gender narrative messaging, and how we can use this as a tool to bring us closer to the world that we deserve?
Yeah, so the race class narrative, which some of you may have heard of, was developed by Anat Schenker-Osorio, ASO Communications, along with Lake Research Partners and Demos. It was a messaging framework that was developed both with quantitative and qualitative analysis. It was tested in the field through deep canvassing in various states. And from that, in around 2020, 2021, it became clear that the transphobic siren song of the right had to be countered with another tool that would allow us to have race, class, and gender in conversation with each other. The reality is you cannot do LGBTQ work without a race, class, plus analysis. We're talking about national origin. We're talking about disability. We're talking about faith. It all has to be included in there. And so the race, class, gender narrative was developed with ASO Communications, Lake Research Partners, and GSA Network because we were looking at specifically the ways in which trans youth were being attacked and how we could combat that via messaging on athletics, medical care. And obviously, y'all have walked in the back. I'm going to plug it again. We have these wonderful reporter guides that talk about what are some of the ways in which we can engage in mobi-suasion, which again, if you heard Anat Schenker-Osorio speak, you know that mobi-suasion is both mobilization and persuasion at the same time. And so the race, class, gender narrative talks about two particular narratives that I want to touch on, which the first is we all have an authentic self. We all have this idea of who we are that depending on the spaces that we are in, we either feel comfortable sharing or have felt at times hurt by. And so using the context of an authentic self, we're able to engage in conversations with people who may not be thinking about their own gender experiences in that context. You know, for the first time that you were told that you look prettier when you smile, the first time that you were told that boys don't cry. All of these things are gender experiences that people tend not to think about. And then add in that level of the first time that someone assumed that you were the assistant and not the manager. The first time that you walked into a courtroom and someone thought that you were the plaintiff and not the lawyer. Adding in that race, class, gender component of that to the concept of authentic selves. Next, we also have the concept of freedom from boxes. So the idea that none of us, nobody puts baby in a corner, nobody likes to be put in a box by someone else. And more than that, we don't like being put in a box that then dictates what types of schools we can go to, how we can dress, who we can love, what we can accomplish. Those two concepts, freedom from boxes and our authentic selves, are ways in which we can engage in conversations with folks. And again, going back to the conversations, because we all have to be organizers in this time, how do we have conversations that open up people to understand that our genders are things that are our own, are things that should not be, things that pit us against other communities, and also should not be legislated on in ways that deprive us of the ability to live authentically.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. So we have about 7 minutes before I want to get to the Q&A, so I do want to hear from just a few of you. We've talked a lot today about creating this broader we, messaging across movements, bringing people helping more people be seen by our messaging by not just guessing, but actually being in conversation with organizers within those communities, individuals within those communities, understanding their daily lives and what is important to them, the struggles they face, as a way to bring more people into our movement and build together narrative power for this world we deserve. So I want to hear from a couple of you examples from your work of how you have done that.
Yeah, I can start. Thank you for breaking that down, Anna. I appreciate you deep. So like I said, I'm one of the co-founders and co-executive directors of the Black LGBTQ Migrant Project, or BLMP, and that fiscally sponsored organization, shout out to Transgender Law Center again for incubating us, is a product of a race, class, gender narrative framework. And so when we were coming up with BLMP, at that time it was the rise, the peak of the Black Lives Matter movement, and a bunch of us realized that in conversations around Black liberation, we're not actually talking about the root of forced migration and Black immigrant folks specifically in the United States. We saw a hole that needed to be filled, and even when we think about the vision statement of BLMP, it uses that race, class, gender analysis or narrative framework. So we believe in a world where no one is forced to give up their homelands, right? That is a broader we. When we think about all of the things that tie together Black people, regardless of where you're from, is this idea that you have been forced to migrate for some reason. If not the transatlantic slave trade or economic disparities because of the loss of labor or imperialism or patriarchy or patriarchal violence, so on and so forth. So this idea that what ties Black people together is this idea that we have been forced to migrate sometime in our ancestral life or in our lifetimes right now. And so BLMP as an organization specifically, we go to different movements that we should be included in and do some of that deep relational work. So me and Anna actually met in 2018 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we brought together a bunch of national queer and trans immigrant rights organizations. And we were under this umbrella of
Trans queer migrant freedom.
Trans queer migrant freedom. And that space was one of the most transformative spaces that I've ever been in, right? We talked about what does anti-Blackness look like in the Latinx community and in the API community. We had Encapia there, which is a very amazing API queer organization. And we were having conversations and being in struggle around, even though we have these same identities, what are the places that we're missing? And where are we missing, and who are we not advocating for? And so those are just some of the ways that BLMP uses that framework to propel our work.
I want to just add, and you mentioned it already, Aluchi, but when we're talking about forced migration, the way in which that often looks is that the U.S. has created circumstances in other countries very, very, very specifically that have forced people to need to leave their countries and come here to experience additional financial and economic hardship. That is not an accident. I'm Mexican. My family immigrated here from Mexico. That's not an accident that the countries that we're seeing immigrate here are doing so because of severe poverty in their countries that were literally created by the United States. So I want to mention that. I also want to mention in the economic justice movement as a whole, I've heard a lot recently around wealth building, and I would just like to take a moment to talk about that.
Talk about it.
Because I have a problem with it. And I think that when we think about what it means to solve for poverty, it's easy for us to have the initial reaction to say, I want to build wealth within my community. community and financial wealth specifically. And I understand that intention because it's a reaction, right? And that makes so much sense. And if we're leaning into our anti-capitalist values, we're not trying to build independently wealthy people to just exist in this world. We're looking to build a society and a culture that involves community, that we take care of each other, that we have stability and safety. That does not look like a bunch of people who are financially wealthy. And I think sometimes we forget that because we're all living with a lot of scarcity. But I think if we take a moment and we envision what we want our world to look like, it does look like community and us caring for each other and us being able to support each other together, not separate.
The other thing that I would add is that, kind of building on what we've been talking here, is that, and I think Amara Jones talks about this most kind of succinctly, is this idea that, it's not that one day a large swath of Americans woke up and were like, you know what, I really don't like trans people. That just didn't happen. This is an orchestrated effort by folks on the right to say, okay, let's message test, let's find out where the fissures are, and let's find the folks that we are going to target. And the reason I think that's important, going back to what Anna was talking about, is because if we believe that there are just like people out there who just of their own volition don't like us, it's going to be a lot harder to have that conversation. Whereas if we know that there are folks and forces on the right who are selling a story that is wrong, and that we need to figure out how to tell our story, that's going to be the thing that is going to help us have those conversations, have those uncomfortable conversations with folks who hold beliefs that have been ingrained in them through right-wing efforts. But that's also how we're going to bring those folks back to a world, back to that bigger we. I think this is also true within the abortion rights movement and the reproductive justice movement, where as folks are, since the Dobbs decision, as folks are really starting to see where this path is leading us, we are seeing more and more people who are like, you know what, I'm not super comfortable on a personal level with abortion, but actually, I don't like where we're going. This is starting to look real scary. And we need to welcome those people back and say, okay, ultimately, we have some disagreements, but we all agree that this is a scary place to be, and it's getting scarier, and how do we build that work together?
Yeah, I really appreciate both of what Maria and Teal said. Just to reiterate Teal's point around the solution to poverty not being wealth. I think we see this in the immigrant rights movement a lot, is that the solution to immigration is the pathway to citizenship. And I'm going to say it twice because I want everyone in this room to hear, the solution to forced migration will never be American citizenship. It will never be American citizenship. It will never be access to American citizenship. And so one thing that BLMP is very cognizant of and invests a lot of time in is organizing in our home countries, right? So organizing to stop forced migration at the head, rather than only thinking about immigrants when they come into this country. And so when we think about how do we make this bigger and broader I also behoove us to include people in the global south when we're doing our work, because that is something that we're missing right now, something that is not happening. We are never going to get to liberation if people in the Congo are still suffering, right? And so how are we continuing to broaden and make ourselves more uncomfortable for our society as a whole to become comfortable?
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And I just wanted to, Maria's point, the Amara Jones resource that they are mentioning is called Anti-Trans Hate Machine. Folks want to check it out on Translash's website. It has a lot of really great context for many of the discussions that we've had today. So I do want to turn it over to the Q&A for this last 10, 15 minutes to see if there are questions from the audience for our wonderful panelists.
Hi, my name is Kate Higgins. I'm with Blue Rose Research. We do a lot of surveying and policy polling and generally asking people questions and trying to understand, what the electorate thinks about different progressive issue areas. One thing that I've noticed, having been part of queer, at least campus organizing back in the day and just watching, the movement as I've gotten older, it feels like we're very reactionary and not as proactive at combating Republican disinformation about trans lives, trans healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. There is some interesting social psychology research that suggests that if you give people some kind of information before they're exposed to that disinformation, it has an inoculative effect. And I'm wondering if you guys have done any thinking about that, about how we need to be proactive, because people who don't know anything about trans people, and most people in America still don't really, an opportunity to get to them before the first thing they hear is bad info is, I think, maybe worth some digging into. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
I mean, to start, I think there are a lot of wonderful trans-led local organizations that have been doing that. And so there are so many, you can find, like in this room, there are organizations and brilliant, beautiful leaders that have been putting forth stories, content, all of that, talking about what trans lives are about and not just focusing on the trauma novella narrative around violence. But I also think that one of, in terms of talking about tough conversations, it is that the LGBTQ movement for a long time was led by white, cis, middle-class people.
Yep.
And still, very loudly, lots of white trans folks that are leading the conversation in this very reactionary place. This is one of the things that, queer and trans folks of color in the space have consistently pushed for is we know exactly what it is like to navigate moments like this. We live at the intersections of liberation. Please uplift the leadership of Black trans leaders, period. And give them money to do this work on a broader scale.
Yeah, and I'll add, so we've done some work on this in the reproductive justice space. We called it pre-bunking. Basically, this idea of, can we expose folks, and specifically expose folks to stories of people talking about their experience with reproductive health care, and can we normalize it as, if you have the flu, you go to the doctor. If you are in a place, where you need reproductive health care, you go to the doctor. Like, where no one here is going to argue, no one here is going to argue against abortion, but no one in the world is going to argue that you shouldn't go to the doctor if you are, if you have the flu, if you have COVID, if you have whatever. Then why are we arguing about abortion? And we found in message testing that is really effective. The challenge then is scale, is how do we get this in front of folks? And I think we're seeing, to Anna's point, we are seeing more and more people talk about narrative strategy, but and this is like plug to the funders out there, we're not seeing the resources to put that strategy into practice. So, more dollars, please, because I actually think we do have the knowledge. We just need to get it out there.
And I also want to note, a lot of the messaging research firms do not do their research on the issues that they're being paid to do messaging research on, and do not actually have a narrative strategy to do it. They just do not have the range. And so you have a lot of message testing that focuses predominantly on trying to convince, again, white middle-class voters, and is, again, kind of also furthering a narrative of trans medical essentialism, that trans experiences are solely medical experiences. And this is where the narrative strategy part comes in, because we have to talk about trans lives, period. All of them. We do not start at the healthcare part. That is arguing on the opposition's terms. So this is, again, where like everybody focuses on pre-bunking, myth-busting, all of that. I'm like, please stop. Focus on going back to your narrative strategy, proactively thinking about the vision of the world that you want to push, and actually build from there.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you, Anna. Just to expand, I think communities know how to talk to their communities. A really good example of a narrative strategy that was it was impactful for me, and I'm not even Asian. And Capia did a narrative campaign around parents of queer children speaking in their own languages around why they support their children. And I remember like when that came out, my mom, like best friend, was just like bawling. And their parents were shifted by that conversation. And so just thinking about like, not only does narrative strategy have to broaden the we, but it also has to be culturally relevant, right? It also has to move the people that are necessary to move.
Well, and that also speaks to the building the broader we, because in order to build a broader we have to do it in a way that is culturally relevant to the people that we want to bring into the we.
Exactly.
So I want to turn it back to the audience. Sai, our videographer, is my wonderful mic runner. We can take 2 more questions. Yeah.
Thank you. You know, I've been doing immigrant rights work, and then now I do a lot of different things, but mostly in comms. And you know, I think I do understand the race, class, and plus narrative fairly well, but I feel like the rights narrative is just, I mean, it's a conspiracy, right? But it's like very simple, and like you can condense it into one sentence. And you know, from immigrant rights, it's like white genocide. Abortion, I also hear a lot about like it's white genocide. And then I'm starting to hear a lot about like LGBTQ people. It's like indoctrination for white genocide. So like, how do we combat this one very simple, like, you know, viral, in a way, disinformation conspiracy theory thing, right?
I think this goes back to the myth busting and reactionary strategies that we apply. We spend so much time talking to them. Do you know what they are doing? They are talking to their base. They are always talking to their people. We talk to lawmakers, we talk to media, we respond to their arguments. We spend no time talking about our affirmative vision of the world. I am not interested in combating what they're putting forth. I'm interested in ensuring that us as a movement, I know this moment is scary. That's not, every single panel has said this moment is scary in some way. What it has done is robbed us of the imagination to actually believe that in this paradigm shift moment, we can be proposing things that move us forward. And so, you know, to your point about like, how do we respond to this moment? Like, this is an opportunity for folks to say, universal basic income, guaranteed income. It's a time to identify as a reparationist. It is a moment to identify as being a part of a global struggle. It's a time to redefine what a democracy can mean when it is not based on extraction, productivity, etc. So that is like the direction to go in. What is your actual vision, and are you talking to your community about it, and are you getting them excited about it? So excited that they talk to other people about it.
Yeah, I think just to like further that, white supremacy only works if it expands its definition of who is included inside of white supremacy, right? And so when we see queer, gay, white men now supporting these white supremacist tropes. We see, for example, the white trans woman, I forgot her name, Jenner, something. Caitlyn Jenner, yes. Right, we see discriminated or underrepresented minorities now touting these like right-leaning narratives. And so what is the affirmative that we're putting out? And I think that's very important. And also, who are we listening to, right? Who is leading? Who is saying these things? I say this all the time, but Black trans women specifically are the gateway to liberation, because at every single intersection, they have thought about what liberation looks like. So who are you actually listening to? And also, how are you then talking to your communities that you can move around this liberatory vision?
Yeah, thank you so much. I do want to take one more question. So we have, I believe Sai is next to someone right now.
My name's Emma. I work with Campaign for Southern Equality. We're an LGBT rights organization doing work in the South. And I work in communication, so I'm messaging about trans issues all the time. And one narrative that I've been seeing a lot is the parents' rights narrative, which for those of y'all who aren't aware, it's basically the message around gender-affirming care, that parents know what's best for their kids and the government shouldn't be interfering with this care, and that's why it should be legal. And I really don't believe that that's the best narrative to use because it leaves out so many trans kids whose parents don't affirm them and don't want them to have care. Yeah, and I just feel really strongly about that, but I keep seeing from national organizations putting out this messaging about the parents' rights narrative. I want to shift more towards like a bodily autonomy narrative, but people are, I think I get a lot of pushback because people are like, it's not legal for someone under 18 to get this care without their parents' permission, so we can't say that. It's going to freak everyone out. It's going to get us this pushback. But I don't know. I guess I'm just looking for advice on like how to convince folks that this is the right way to go, especially as someone who's coming from a place without a ton of like organizational power.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to organizing principles 101 in terms of finding the folks that you can rock with and building with them. And at times you need to build up that kind of social proof of like, hey, we started talking about this and it got people excited. And this fear of pushback, again, I think going back to Aluchi's point and going back to like Teal, Maria, all have made points about how sometimes when we're pushing forth these bold ideas, people within our own movements are going to be uncomfortable. But then you can roll out the receipts of, look at within the reproductive justice movement, what it looked like when we hinged access to abortion to parental rights. What does it look like, to have those moments where the pitfall is so clear? And then again, building up the ecosystem of people. It might not be your organization that is pushing it forth, but are you continuing to agitate within that organization to lift up those narratives? And I think, obviously Maria will have something to add to this, but this idea of just continuing to do relationship building within this room of folks who can explore with you what it looks like to bring liberatory narratives to the surface.
Yeah, no, yes, I absolutely agree with all of that. I think the other thing that I think about a lot of times with these, like the right has had the same playbook going back to the civil rights era. Like this parental rights argument, that was the same argument that was used to support school segregation. Like they've been saying the same thing over and over again, and they just sort of roll it out. So in some ways, like we know what they're gonna say. They have like their 5 kind of things that they talk about. And so I think for our side, what's always useful to come back to is, it's like messaging 101. We don't want to be repeating their talking points. So like at a very practical level, if you're like trying to get your organization to do something, be like, do we really want to be saying what they're saying and saying we're not doing that? Like it's, again, to Anna's point, like we're not myth busting, we're not debunking. We know what are the narratives that work on our side. We know what are the narratives that shift people's hearts and minds. And so what are the ways that we can then shift the conversation to our ground? So like we're not constantly responding, but we're actually talking about the thing that, the thing that we know is gonna be most impactful.
Thank you so much, friends. This panel, thank you all for joining. This was Messaging Trans Futures, Narrative Power for the World That We Deserve. I know that there's another panel in this room in about 15 minutes, so I do invite folks who have questions or would like to speak to the panelists up here to relocate to the hallway in order to do that, so that the wonderful Netroots production team can set up for the next panel. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time.